You're listening in on an animated discussion about Batman the Animated Series with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from the Cinematropolis.com. And today we'll be discussing the real Season 2 finale. That's right, we're going to be talking about Batman SubZero. So Joshua, I just had to throw that out there. This is the real finale. So obviously we talked about Batgirl Returns last week, and that is technically the last episode of Season 2, or also the end of the OG animation style before we go to the redesign. But Batman SubZero also, it is in the same animation style with a much bigger budget as the first two seasons of the show. And it really feels like it brings some plot threads a little more to a head than maybe Batgirl Returns.
It's still sort of anachronistic for us to expect any kind of, season finale or series finale, but I think I agree with you. It feels like a big capper. If nothing else, we are saying goodbye to that era with this big spectacle, whereas Batgirl Returns is the opposite of a big spectacle.
And I mean, again, you're totally right. TV at that time was a different animal, but I mean, we did get Mask of the Phantasm at the end of season 1, right? And
sure.
Again, it's really weird that they would end it that way, because I think we had the same conversation at the end of season 1. It's like, this is a really strange episode for them to take a break on. And
right.
But then we get the big cinematic experience, and Batman SubZero did not go to the theater, but we did get a home release. It did have a bigger budget. I don't know what the budget was, but it was clearly much bigger than even 3 episodes of Batman the Animated Series put together. So I think we get to see a lot more of the spectacle. They hone in on Mr. Freeze, which is a character that we've invested a lot in. Even though he's only been in 2 episodes before this, I feel like the audiences are probably pretty bought in to that character's the tragedy of that character's arc. And obviously the writers, Paul Dini, Bruce Timm, they were really invested in that character as well. So this feels a lot more like a capper. Yeah, I mean, it's weird that it would come in the home video. And actually the plot's going to thicken when we talk about the production cycle for this movie as well.
Well, let's do that, because we are kind of off of our own format here. There is no title card in the way that we would normally start these conversations.
Wait, what are you talking about? I saw a very 90s-tastic execution of Batman SubZero at the beginning, Joshua. I mean, did you not see that?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about it. But it's not, it's not quite the setup that we would expect from the title card in any given episode. But it's, at the same time, this feels kind of like a really long, excellent episode. So tell me a little more about the production history, because I know a couple things and it is fascinating.
Okay, so first and foremost, I want to say I fell into this rabbit hole because I was researching it. And the thing that tipped me off was, wow, the 3D animation. Now, we witnessed some 3D animation in Mask of the Phantasm, but I believe it was largely just during the opening credits sequence when we're in...
Yeah, the cityscape at the beginning, yes.
But I watched it and I was like, this looks like dated CGI, but it actually looks kind of cool. Like, they were able to make it work. It was more fluid than, say, Mask of the Phantasm. And I was like, this looks like 90s CGI. So then I'm looking... I was thinking this movie came out in 96, right? Because I knew Superman the Animated Series was also 96. I was thinking this is probably 96. Well, it turns out SubZero didn't get released until March 17th, 1998. And then I started thinking, that's kind of late in the game. Wasn't that after the redesign started airing? And sure enough, it looks like the redesign started airing in late 97. So that means the redesign actually started airing on TV before SubZero came to home video. Now, here's where it gets really, really interesting. Because Cold Comfort, that is the Mr. Freeze episode during the redesign, I want to say is the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th. It's really early redesign territory. It's one of the first episodes you see. And clearly, if you watch them chronologically, the way they were plotted, Cold Comfort very clearly takes place after SubZero.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't want to spoil it for our listeners, but it's very, it picks up the plot threads from SubZero. Now, the reason this happened was because SubZero was supposed to be released as kind of a way to help promote Batman and Robin, the Joel Schumacher film. And because that movie was so poorly received, they delayed Batman SubZero by an entire year, which put it after the redesign. So Cold Comfort, the follow-up to this episode, actually aired on October 11th, 1997. So about 5 months before SubZero came out on home video, and it was 2 different animation styles. So it kind of, it sounds like a really confusing experience to have watched in real time, I'll be honest.
I don't honestly remember being that thrown by it, but I don't remember much about my first viewing of SubZero other than feeling a little let down because it wasn't Mask of the Phantasm, you know? Which is not fair, and we will get to it.
Yeah.
but that's really the thing that I really remember. Usually I get to do the real-time commentary on this because I was living it, but man, I just don't remember it being that big a deal, But it makes me realize that the Mystery of the Batwoman straight-to-video that was done in the new animation style must have come out almost on the heels, really, of SubZero, because the New Adventures of Batman was not on that long.
So you want to know a fun fact, Joshua? And Mystery of the Batwoman, I might just check this right now, but I want to say it didn't come out until Justice League was on TV. Like, it was late. Like, I know based on the story, you're like, no, that doesn't make any sense, because you're right. But that came out really late in the game, because...
You're right. 2003.
2003. Okay, yeah. So Justice League had been on TV for a full 2 years. So Batman, the animated series, the redesign, or I guess the new Batman Adventures, if you want to call it that, had been out for like 5 years or so. No, 6 years. So interesting.
What a weird mess.
Yeah. Indeed. Now, I do want to circle back and talk a little about comparing it to Mask of the Phantasm. So I think it's really interesting that we get this big theatrical release for the end of season 1. Because again, season 1 had a really non-consequential last episode. Get a big cinematic experience. So I'm sure for season 2, they were thinking something similar. And it seems like the intention was for this to be bigger than it was. I do wonder, because Mask of the Phantasm bombed at the box office. It didn't make a ton of money when it initially came out. It wasn't until all the Blu-ray sales and all the decades worth of sales that it actually managed to recover its budget. So I'm wondering if they knew from the get-go this was going to be straight to home video. Because in some ways, the action set pieces here are pretty big, but I think it lacks the kind of the character... the emotional drive of the characters you would expect to see in a cinematic film as well. Because this is definitely leaning pretty heavily on the action. And even Mr. Freeze, who is generally a very tragic, deeply emotional character. I mean, he's good in this movie. He's good in SubZero, but it's certainly not him at his most vulnerable, I would say.
I mean, not after the opening scene that kind of sets up the conflict.
Right.
He is just a raw nerve at the very beginning. And then after that, he really settles into, I think I have something in my notes like, when all you have is a freeze gun, everything looks like a nail. Yeah. Because he's just freezing the hell out of everything with almost no thought, So yeah, it is not fair for us to compare this to Mask of the Phantasm, which should not have been created really in the first place. Like, it was an accident that it existed, And then it just happens to just be full of all of this like pathos and all these themes and all this stuff that's going on. And we've talked about a lot of BTAS. It's not like all that stuff was foreign to the animated series, but to have it really like brought out and just like made the front and center of this theatrical release. And then we turn around and we get one that's much more action focused. And we're like, yeah, but it's not Mask of the Phantasm.
Exactly.
It's not fair, but it's also almost impossible not to draw some comparisons there.
Well, I mean, again, I was a wee one when this happened. Although I do remember I do remember seeing trailers for SubZero on some of the videos I would rent from like Family Video or whatever video store I was renting stuff from.
Absolutely.
I remember I remembered specifically the polar bears, and then of course the really cheesy 90s tastic voice being like, Batman SubZero coming to home video soon. I remember that. But I mean, if you were a Batman fan though, at the time, this was only the second Batman movie, animated Batman movie you'd seen. So, and with the bar being set so high with Mask of the Phantasm, even though it's on home video, I 100% agree that you shouldn't compare the two. But I certainly understand why those comparisons would be made, because they're the same animation style. Well, it feels bigger. There's a bigger budget. It's Mr. Freeze, which while he's not the Phantasm, you just feel like you're so emotionally invested in that character. And I see that. I see how you could be disappointed.
And this will actually kind of bring it back to another little weird bit of trivia that you brought up about SubZero. But the other part of that is that by this point, Batman fans had been kind of beaten down at the movie theater, at this stage. I actually think that there is a much more interesting cultural critique being brought to bear on Joel Schumacher's Batman movies now.
Oh, totally.
And there is value there. Like, there are things that are worth talking about in those movies, but they aren't, good, like in most objective ways. He knew exactly what he was doing and he did it. But Batman and Robin is really just rough.
So I'll say this. I think, we were watching Tim Burton's Batmans, and those movies are very strange in their own right. Let's just be honest. And
it's true.
And I like them, especially Batman Returns. That one's really weird. I like both of them a lot. However, you kind of have this shifting gears between Batman Returns and Batman Forever, where we definitely shift towards Schumacher, who is still a lot more restrained in that film. Now, granted, it's still wildly different. It's still campy. You still got the bat nipples. Like, there's a lot of kooky, like, goofy things in that movie. But Batman, after the success of Batman Forever, you get Batman and Robin, where he is basically given free reign to do whatever, and we see where that takes us. And I just think it's one of those things. It's audience expectations, a big part of it. And I just don't think audiences really wanted that, something more. I don't think they wanted this Joel Schumacher Batman at this point in time.
Yeah, it's worth saying it's not the goofy that's the problem, because Batman 89 is goofy as hell.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's different brands of goofy, though. I just want to reiterate.
Yes,
It's more okay. So one of them is Tim Burton weird and kind of quirky in the Tim Burton way. I don't know. Audiences, if you aren't familiar with Tim Burton, Gothic literature is also really silly sometimes, but in that sort of way, kind of a combination between a Gothic horror and a soap opera and superheroes. Versus, I think you get Joel Schumacher, who is definitely leaning more towards like the 66, Batman 66, but it's his own version of it. It's not the same, but he's aiming to do that sort of like campy, fun, ridiculous Batman in that way. But it's not 100% the same thing, So
it was decades before I realized that Batman 89 is a spiritual successor to Batman 66. Because you had to think about
Interesting.
It, right? It's basically Gothic camp in Batman 89. And even more so when you get the Penguin introduced in Batman Returns,
it's
right?
89, the Batman Returns at 92, I think. That is full-blown, like, wild camp, Gothic camp, though. It's just a little different.
And then when you get Schumacher, he's not doing, and let me be clear, Burton wasn't doing an homage either. He'd never even seen Batman 66. No. But somehow, based on comic books or just assuming that Batman was kind of a ridiculous character that we were instead going to treat very seriously, which is, very much the definition of camp, he winds up in this very Gothic camp area, which was really interesting. And it was weird, but also like serious looking enough that we could all pretend it was serious and grown up,
Right.
And Schumacher comes along and just gives us way too much of the obvious 66 homage for the time, and maybe even for now. There's more stuff going on there. And actually, Glenn Weldon writes in The Caped Crusade about revisiting those movies after the fact, especially as a gay man, that I was fascinated. And so I recommend that book. But to put it in the context of SubZero, I get Batman 89, which blows everybody's lid off, right? I get Batman Returns, which I was lightly disappointed by, and I was not alone, right?
Oh, no.
Like, now I can go back to it and appreciate what was going on. But again, as a follow-up to 89, it didn't pack that punch. Sure. Then you get Schumacher, and it's like, well, I guess that this one with Riddler and Two-Face is okay. But then we're going to go to Batman and Robin. And this is the point where, as you say, Schumacher was just given free reign and just turned all of his worst impulses for Batman up to 11. It gets this thing pushed back. And I should have actually enjoyed SubZero more when it first came out, because it should have been like a cooling tonic after all this other stuff. But instead, I was just like, why isn't it Mask of the Phantasm?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting, because again, I haven't. I mean, I saw this film when I was young, but I definitely didn't see it when it was new. And I think that's some good history you bring to the table, because, I mean, when I saw it, it was still completely divorced from Batman and Robin, even though they came out about the same time in my brain, because I was so young and I didn't see them close enough together. Yeah. Like, they're separate in my mind. So, but I could 100% see how you'd be really disappointed in Batman and Robin, but then be like, but I don't want Mr. Freeze. Arnold Schwarzenegger just kind of ruined the character for a lot of folks, I'm sure, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it was rough. I'll say all that to say, revisiting this, I was not fair to it. I really enjoyed SubZero this time around. I still think there are a lot of really odd choices going on here, considering all these influences, but on its own merits, it is like very exciting. There's a lot of really good like adventure and action. Barbara Gordon is amazing in it.
There's some nice plot twists in there too.
There are. Yeah.
I think just my thoughts about the movie in general is I really like it as well. And I do think, comparing it to Mask of the Phantasms is Fool's Errand. I think this is a really good, more expensive 3-part episode. I mean,
yes,
but structured like a movie, not structured like a 3-part episode, but it feels like a very big episode that happened to have some budget. Maybe not as theatrical as Mask of the Phantasm, but it definitely flexes its muscles sometimes.
No, I agree. I mean, in fact, honestly, when it comes to the action and the adventure part of this movie, the animation is way better than anything we see in Mask of the Phantasm. Like, it's way more fluid and dynamic and interesting to watch as things are blowing up and people are throwing punches and stuff. Like, all of that is light years beyond anything going on in Mask of the Phantasm. It's the thematic stuff that doesn't get brought to bear in that same way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Unlike Mask of the Phantasm, which you can sort of take or leave. Like, if you never saw Mask of the Phantasm, the rest of the universe would track well enough. I mean, there's some cameos in Justice League. But SubZero, if you're following Mr. Freeze's story, you really do have to see it. Like, it's a pretty pivotal episode. Yes.
Episode.
A pretty pivotal story in that character's arc throughout the universe. I mean, you can't miss this one. So I do find that kind of interesting. This is, narratively speaking, this is an essential watcher versus Mask of the Phantasm, which it's like, it enhances what you know already, but you don't have to see it. And this is, there are 5 Mr. Freeze stories in the entire DCAU. You have Heart of Ice, and you have Deep Freeze, which we just talked about a couple weeks ago. And you have this film, SubZero, and then you have Cold Comfort with the redesign, and then you get an episode. I want to say it's called Meltdown in Batman Beyond.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And as we kind of talked about in the Deep Freeze episode, unlike most of the villains on the show, every time Mr. Freeze shows up, there's a character advancement. There's a plot advancement.
Yeah, he progresses. He really, or regresses, as it were. But yeah, he moves. He has an arc every time.
Yep. So I think that's another great reason for listeners out there to consider watching this film, because firstly, it's still a top notch. You could look at it as a top-notch Batman the Animated Series story. And if you like Mr. Freeze, you're not going to Cold Comfort, and that's why I find it so hilarious that Cold Comfort aired before this came out, because Cold Comfort is dealing with the consequences of this movie. So it's essential.
Yeah. As I was watching this, I actually wished that we had tagged Alexandra back in for one more episode, because this is such a better showing for Barbara Gordon than Batgirl Returns.
Oh, totally. And she's not even, I think you mentioned this to me right before we just started recording. She's not even Batgirl in it that much, but we get to see so much great Barbara Gordon stuff that when she's Batgirl, it like just enhances, the character overall. It's great stuff.
She's clearly super competent. She nearly saves herself several times.
Oh, yeah. Like she's 95% of the way there before Batman and Robin show up.
It's very impressive. It is weird, though, to kind of return to the fact that this was supposed to be released at the same time as Batman and Robin, where Mr. Freeze and a version of Batgirl were big deals in the movie. This is released with Mr. Freeze and Batgirl in it, except Batgirl is almost non-existent. Like, she's introduced as Batgirl, and then she's Barbara Gordon the entire rest of the movie, easily 90% of it.
Oh, yeah.
These choices are bonkers.
It is interesting. Also, fun fact for listeners: Batman and Robin, Batgirl's not Barbara Gordon. It's really strange. She's Alfred's niece.
Well, she is Alfred's niece.
I don't even remember her name,
I believe.
But
I don't remember her name.
Yeah, she's Alfred's niece, played by Alicia Silverstone. The details.
That casting makes so much sense for the moment that movie came out, but then the character choices that she's Alfred's niece, and we're not here to litigate Joel Schumacher's choices. We're here to litigate SubZero's choices.
That's true. If you want,
but it is weird. It's weird.
Yes.
How is this supposed to be a tie-in in any way? You know what I mean? Like, the brand synergy is non-existent.
The only thing I can think of is it's trying to ride the zeitgeist. But here's the thing about zeitgeist in 1998 or 1997. Like, I understand how the zeitgeist works now because the internet's a thing. And I guess technically the internet was around then, but it wasn't the same. Like, I'm trying to recontextualize. Like, I guess like the zeitgeist was you went to high school or middle school and you talked to your friends and it's like, what are they talking about? Like it's not like the internet where clearly the entire culture is thinking about certain things. So it's like, okay, studios are going to release movies about those things, even if they're not directly connected.
That's exactly how it went. Like, I would love to have like an anthropologist do papers on Batman 89 and it becoming this cultural juggernaut, because how? Well, it's weird, right? With BTAS, we understand how it became a cultural juggernaut. It's in your house every day, day in, day out, for at least a half hour. Every day, That's easy to figure out. But when these individual like bits of culture become these big deals, again, in a much more difficult to pass likes and dislikes on to your fellow peer group, it's crazy.
It's just strange to me. It's just strange to me to think about, like, I understand, like, again, going back to the marketing angle, I understand why people market to the zeitgeist right now, because the internet, like, it's just all over, it's all documented, you can see it, and these trends connect millions of people together, right? Like on Twitter, things are trending. But I just, I can't imagine, I know there were like surveys and things, but I can't imagine back in the 90s them being like, all right, you know what? We should go ahead and release this companion movie. They're not related at all, but people are going to want more Batgirl and Mr. Freeze and an animated, you know what I mean? I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah. Anthropology. I want to have someone do some anthropology on the 80s and 90s and how the zeitgeist works.
Yeah. But we know, kind of in retrospect, Joel Schumacher kind of murdered that version of the Batman franchise, and this gets postponed a year, and all that makes 100% sense to me.
You know what's kind of a bummer? And you tell me a little about your experience. It sounds like you were pretty burned by Batman and Robin, but it does kind of suck that Mr. Freeze from Batman and Robin so blatantly rips off the story from the animated series. I mean, we've talked about it on this show about how the animated series reinvented Mr. Freeze in like a really sad, tragic way. And then to have Joel Schumacher rip off that version in such an unapologetic way and then make it super campy and silly. I mean, I do see how, again, I can see how you would be like, I just don't want any more Mr. Freeze after this, because
it was tough. Honestly, it didn't carry over into other versions of the character for me. But again, I've been reading comic books my whole life. So this idea of this continuity being different from this one, and if I just wait long enough, there'll be a different, creative direction or whatever, that's always been really easy for me to accept, So really, I can understand why that made the marketing department or the release department make their choices, but I don't think I would have held Arnold Schwarzenegger against Tim and Denny that hard myself.
Sure. Okay. All right.
Because again, what I held against it was that it wasn't Mask of the Phantasm.
Well, that's a significantly more reasonable. I mean, like, again, I don't know if that's warranted, but I can understand that, right? So, I mean, I maybe we could talk a little bit about the story here. I mean, you mentioned, Barbara Gordon, Batgirl being featured so much. I love she's introduced essentially as Batgirl because you have Gordon introducing his daughter, Barbara, but then it's cross-cut with her doing Batgirl stuff. And I think it's kind of funny the way he's like, Dick, you're dating my daughter, which, by the way, this is the first time that we see Dick and Barbara together as an actual, proper, super official
couple. As a couple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we'd seen them together. We knew they were friends. There's maybe some subtext that there might be something else going on. But this was a massive escalation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're going on weekend retreats together. I mean, yeah, this is like a thing. This is a real thing.
Well, and having sort of semi-serious conversations with her father about your relationship. It's not like Jim Gordon's a warm, fuzzy guy,
right.
So yeah, that's a big deal. In fact, here is my suggestion to you for SubZero. SubZero is more a Barbara Gordon movie than it is anybody else's movie.
Oh, that's interesting. So do tell, because I mean, I do feel like Mr. Freeze. I mean, he drives the conflict, and I do feel like there is a beginning, middle, and end for that character. But I mean, I would certainly, so I'd love to hear you kind of go into depth there, but I certainly more so than a Batman or Robin story. That I can get behind 100%.
Yeah. So here's my feelings about Mr. Freeze. And so just stop me at any moment and react to this. But the beginning of SubZero is very, very focused on Mr. Freeze. And it's good, right? Like, we see that he's kind of created a life for himself after Deep Freeze, after what happened. I actually get a lot of sort of Frankenstein's monster shades from him. He's living in exile and everything he says is very poetic, right, but it's also very misanthropic. He's not really like that interested in the world.
Oh no, he actually seems pretty content with doing exactly what he's doing. Like, he's like sad about his wife, but in his own sort of way, she's still there. She's not dead. She's there. He can't cure her, but she's still present. And he can keep her alive. And also, he doesn't have to deal with all the shenanigans. As far as the internal fiction goes, he's already lost her before Deep Freeze and gets her back. So this is the best possible news compared to she's gone forever, right? Mm-hmm. So it definitely starts with him and the submarine crew accidentally cracking Nora's containment tube is the thing that kicks off the story. Like, it's the conflict of the thing, but really, that's not even fair. It is the thing that kicks off the story. It's the thing that makes the rest of the story happen. But the actual conflict of this story is Barbara's attempts at escape. Right.
And also Batman and Robin's attempts to find her. But really, as much as I enjoyed the detective work in this movie, the detective work in this movie is so realistic in a lot of ways that it's actually not as interesting to watch as Barbara's escape attempts.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought you would really like the dig the detective stuff, because I did notice that. That was I mean, we see a lot of detective work that I was not expecting.
No, I love it. It's just like real detective work. You know what I mean? Like, it's actually like following clues and stuff. It's not, don't get me wrong, I love every single bit of it. But when you just lay it next to the very, like, the jumping on the bed and the crawling through the air tunnels and discovering Nora and picking her own locks, and like, Barbara is the active force. She is the motive force of this plot.
100%. Yeah. I mean, because like you said, Batman and Robin don't show up until she has basically escaped, because she's been pretty persistent about it. And she's kind of solved a lot of the mysteries, I would say.
Yeah. She's coming at it from a different direction as Batman and Robin, but she's figured out the thing. You're not taking a blood transfusion.
Yeah.
You're going to kill me.
Well, and they know why, too. It's because she's trying to save Nora, which she didn't know. I think this is the first time we've seen Batgirl in a Mr. Freeze story. I mean, obviously she knows who he is, but she kind of learns exactly why they need her blood, why she was kidnapped, why they're trying to drug her consistently. Yeah. I think all of that's really great stuff. I also thought, from a storytelling perspective, it's really cool. A nice little twist when we're like, you're trying to figure out where's she at? Oh, she's on like an oil drilling. She's offshore. She's like
Right.
so far away. That's a great little plot twist. I mean, I know we're used to more shocking plot twists in 2019, but I think that's a really great, like, oh, you think you can get out of here, but actually, even if you can escape us and inside this building, you're still stuck. You can't get off this island, essentially.
Yes. It's really great for both her side of the plot and Batman and Robin's side of the plot, because it explains why her stakes, why her odds are so stacked against her for escape, right? Even if she gets out of the building, what are you going to do next? And when it comes to the dynamic duo, there's not a thread to pull to get there, you know. It's pretty great. I really like all that stuff. And I'm not even complaining that it's mostly Barbara's movie. It just seemed really strange to me that it would be called SubZero. But once that doctor friend, Dr. Besson, gets involved, he really becomes the driver of Mr. Freeze's side of the story.
Oh no, totally. I think they go out of their way early on to set up what motivates this guy to help Mr. Freeze. So obviously, it's interesting. Mr. Freeze is obviously the bad guy, right? He's the supervillain. I like how they try to like set up this other guy who is a normal guy for all intents and purposes, who's gotten himself into some debt. He's made some bad investments. How he's the real villain. I mean, in a lot of ways, is the real villain, because Mr. Freeze, yeah, he's clearly the bad guy, but also his motivations are a little more noble. At least he's trying to save his wife's life. You can kind of relate to that and empathize with that, and in your own sort of like viewer deal with the devil, you're like, okay, well that checks out. Like I can get behind that, like as a villain motivation. Versus, even though Mr. Freeze is the one doing all the freezing and potentially all the killing of the people, but you have Dr. Belson, who just he's just trying to save his own skin from some bad investments. It's purely driven by his desire for money. That makes him a little more despicable than Mr. Freeze, I think, in a lot of ways.
Oh, I think it makes him a lot more despicable, and I think that the movie wants you to see him that way because he doesn't make it out alive.
Oh no. Well, and I think the thing that really got under my skin was the way he tried to talk Barbara down early on when she was calling this for what it was. And he was like, no, you're good. He tried to kind of, using his I'm a doctor cover, tried to like play the good cop. And it just felt again, Batgirl and Barbara weren't falling for it for a second. But like seeing his attempts to try to manipulate her in the situation to make it easier, sleazy. Make her come more calmly, makes you feel kind of icky. I don't know about you.
No, he's terrible. I mean, this is definitely the point where we can say Mr. Freeze is no longer operating for noble ideals or even ignoble ideals. Like it's not even revenge. He's just willing to murder for Nora.
Right.
And we understand it, but we don't sympathize anymore.
Yeah, no, totally. And I want to reiterate, I don't like sympathize with Mr. Freeze, but I'm saying like, you're like, oh, that's a motivation that makes sense.
We get it.
You feel sad about it, and you understand how I understand how a person who's really in debt could turn to finance, you know what I mean? Like could turn to a crime for finances. So it's not that I don't understand it, but there's a certain human element that's present with Mr. Freeze that makes you feel, it's like a bittersweet, sad feeling for him versus this other guy. We were just
absolutely.
Well, screw you, dude. Like, I mean, you should have made those bad investments.
No, Dr. Besson, we find out through the course of this, nobody likes him. Even before he went missing, his colleagues were saying he comes and goes as he please. So he knows he's brilliant and he's, kind of using that to get away with things. I don't know about you, but I got a very like insider trading feel from the way that they talked about his financial 100%. Trouble.
It sounded like it was some sort of like, he made a really risky, vaguely illegal move, and his broker was basically like, "Hey, man, I warned you about the risks of doing that, so you did it anyway."
And now he's prepared to kidnap a 19-year-old girl and cut her life short to save the life of a woman he doesn't care about at all. He just wants the gold. He is 100% the most despicable, like the real villain. And like I say, the fact that he dies in the process and that Mr. Freeze walks away and Nora lives and everybody's more or less happily ever after, except for that guy who's dead, tells you everything you need to know about what the plot thinks about Dr. Besson too.
Well, and I think that's actually a really great way to incorporate an antagonist. And these are actually sometimes some of my favorite bad guys is when the the conflict is not driven by a particular individual per se. It's driven by like human corruption and really bad human ideas. And what I mean by that is
very noir concept, right?
Yes. Yeah. I love that whenever they can incorporate it into the story, because that's the thing. Yeah. On the surface, Mr. Freeze is bad guy, but then you look, his motivations, you can understand those. This other guy, I understand those. They're really greedy and despicable, kind of makes him an awful person. But also, like, it's not, those are all very realistic motivations. There's not some, like, super, I need to freeze the planet scheme that's, cooking under the surface.
Just to pull an example out of thin air.
Right. Yeah. No reference to deep freeze at all. None. I think the character work here is really good. I think it sets up Barbara Gordon as, we've seen her when she made her debut. We saw her in Batgirl Returns in a much lesser compelling. She wasn't quite as compelling in that appearance, but I think this really sets her up to be like one of the mains, right? Like we see how brilliant she is. We see outside of her Batgirl persona how smart and cunning she is. And I know the redesign had already been on, so Batgirl had essentially become a part of the team at this point by the time this released. But I really feel like this is a great setup for her to take those reins and be like one of your main characters, along with Robin.
Yeah, definitely. We've talked a lot about how every time Mr. Freeze shows up, his story progresses, but that's true for Batgirl too. It's just that the progression in Batgirl Returns was more interesting than what was actually happening in the episode. And so you can kind of forget the progression.
Right. It's more like, oh yeah, she was in that episode to establish that she was back.
Yeah. And she gets wiser in that episode, dealing with Catwoman and realizing who she might be to at least Robin, if not Batman, and that it's not great news, And I think it's really telling that the people who made SubZero knew what they were going to do with the redesign and with the new status quo, and they did not deal with any of that in SubZero.
Right.
We go into this with her not knowing who Batman and Robin is, and Batman and Robin don't know who Batgirl is, and we leave the same way.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But by the time we get to the redesign, we're all on the same team. It's just a lot of really interesting Barbara Gordon choices. I like it.
Yeah, and again, I think this effectively, in a lot of ways, helps set up the redesign, and not just from a plotting perspective, but it feels like we're transitioning into something here that has more continuity, because obviously this is SubZero.
Yes,
it's picking up Deep Freeze. Very clear continuity, and is picking up Batgirl Returns, and then obviously when we get back with the redesign. Yes, there's still like relatively self-contained episodes, but there's still an arc going on there too. There are still character beats that follow through from episode to episode. So I think we're transitioning into less away from the procedural type standalone episodes to, this is a serialized program. Even if they're standalone episodes, they're still kind of feeding into this larger arc that we'll talk a lot more about later. So I think this seems like a really natural transition point, because it pays off on a lot of the investment we've made in the animated series up until this point, and sets up what's going to come next.
Yeah, I agree. We talked a lot during the last couple episodes with Deep Freeze and Batgirl Returns how much of a liminal space that is. Like, it's so obviously the end of BTAS and nothing like what we get in the redesign. This feels like that missing piece. Like, it slots in and you're like, okay, creatively, I understand these movements now. It's very good. It's very good from that perspective.
I agreed. I also, quick note, this is Melissa Gilbert, the original voice actress for Batgirl. Barbara Gordon is replaced by Mary Kay Bergman, who is later replaced by Tara Strong. So I don't think Mary Kay Bergman plays this character for very long, though I thought it was... I do think I prefer Mary Kay Bergman to Melissa Gilbert. I don't know if you noticed some of those nuances, but she just felt more vibrant, a little more lively. I don't know. Might have been my imagination or my state of mind, but I just felt like I connected with the character more in this particular film than maybe the last couple of episodes.
She's definitely different. It's kind of, I really like Melissa Gilbert's take, that we get at the beginning, where she's a little bit sardonic and a little bit, a little cynical about stuff like that. There's just a hint of world weariness in the way that she plays Barbara. That is, probably good that it was gone by the time we get to the New Adventures, when Tara, I believe that's when Tara Strong takes over, now she's living her best life. Like, it makes sense that we would have shaken some of that off. So yeah, even in that, this feels like a really good sort of missing link, This performance kind of splits the middle between those two. So yeah, I did notice she was different, and I couldn't decide if I liked it better or not.
Yeah, it's different. Like, and again, maybe it's not better or worse. It did connect with me a little more. I don't know. But yeah, it's different. Again, maybe saying better or worse is not the right way to talk about it, but it is a different interpretation of the character for sure.
Okay, before we wrap up, I have a couple of little bits of musical trivia that I would like to bring up.
That's my favorite kind.
When Dr. Besson calls Barbara's dorm room and speaks with her roommate, did you happen to notice what song was playing on the radio when her roommate was on the phone?
Okay, I don't know the name of the song, but it was very familiar because I'm pretty sure it's one of those it's a recurring theme, right? Because I've heard it before.
It is not a recurring theme for BTAS. It's Am I Blue, which is the same song that we will hear Batman sing on Justice League Unlimited one day.
Wow. Because that's right. That's the song Batman sings in an episode for Wonder Woman. I think she turns into a pig, right? Yeah, we'll get to that. But yeah, holy smokes. That's a deep cut pull for, wow.
Well, I only recognized it this time because I really like that episode of Justice League
episode.
And have watched it a lot, So you got that. And then here's the other thing for you unlucky people who were not of late teens and early 20s in the mid 90s. The idea that Dick and Barbara would drive up the coast to a jazz festival and do a bunch of swing dancing is not BTAS being in this weird timeless space that might be the 40s and might be the 90s. It's because that was actually having a resurgence in the mid 90s. Really? And that is 100% a thing that 20-year-olds would have gone and done for fun. I know because I was one.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay. Because I totally wrote that off as like a whole, this is something that would have been done like sometime in the 30s, 40s, or 50s.
Well, and so it fits perfectly fine. Like, I mean, it fits even without the mid-90s cultural context. But let me assure you, between 1995 and 2000, I did swing dancing. And I was not the weirdo,
Very nice.
Like, there was a resurgence of this interest. It was quite a time.
Sounds like a fun time. Can we bring it back? Can we bring it back again in the 2020s? I'm all about that. I'll vote for it. Can we vote for it?
Listen, it's one of the less embarrassing trends that I was a part of from the 90s. So it was a good time. It was a lot of fun. And the music was really interesting because you got new bands doing either old songs or old style songs. Like, they were new music, but in the style of this older jazz or swing. So yeah, it was interesting. But as I'm sitting there, I just had nostalgic moments going, yep, that's actually not doing the thing that you might think it is if you just watch the rest of BTAS.
All right, Joshua. So as we wind down, let's go ahead and do a couple different things. First, are we going to recommend this film? How would we rate the SubZero? And then alternate media recommendations, like if our listeners did enjoy this movie, what are some other films, TV, video games, books they could read, watch, or play in conjunction with this film? So what do you think? Overall, Batman SubZero, good movie? Is a recommended watch?
I think it's very much a recommended watch. It's a lot of fun. Barbara Gordon is so amazing, and it's legitimately a bridge between not just the look of BTAS and the redesign, but like the story elements and character stuff. I think you've got to watch it.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. Not only if you're invested in Mr. Freeze, but it really, I mean, if you're going through and watching the entire series, I mean, this is such an important piece of connective tissue. It just sets up what you can expect. It puts the characters where they need to be for that to make sense. And also I just think it's a really good movie. Like it's straight to home video, but it's a very, very high quality short feature length Batman the Animated Series episode. So I don't think you'll be disappointed if you watch it. And of course, I mean, if you've been following Mr. Freeze since Heart of Ice, I mean, this is an essential. This is one of the 5 things you must watch.
You need it.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. You absolutely need it. If you are a for real Mr. Freeze fan, and if you're listening to the show, you might be. Let me assure you that the reason for that is Batman the Animated Series, right? And so if you've never sat down and thought about Mr. Freeze's arc throughout 3 or 4 different cartoon series, do that. You will not be disappointed. And one of the links in that chain is definitely SubZero.
And we didn't touch on this in our discussion, but I just have to say, it's a really bittersweet ending too, appropriately so, for Mr. Freeze.
Yeah.
Even, I mean, it's again tragic. The guy kind of succeeds in what he's trying to do through a roundabout way, but he still can't be with his wife. You know what I mean? He succeeds, but he can't be with his wife. Even though he helped save her life via the help of Bruce Wayne, Batman, he's still, just because of his condition, eternally separated from her in a lot of ways. And that's a tragic note to end on. But seeing the happiness and joy it brings to his face for him to hear that Nora Freeze had a full recovery. I mean, it's a really powerful moment, I think.
I agree. Yeah. See it. Just see it.
I'm going to, of course, second that recommendation. I think this is an essential watch. Maybe not as good as Mask of the Phantasm, but I think it's in a lot of ways just as important. Now moving on to alternate media recommendations, Joshua. So I'll go ahead and kick us off. I had a hard time with this one, but then all of a sudden, light bulb emerged above my head right before we recorded this episode. And I was thinking stories about vengeful spouses. And what I mean is stories about people who lose their loved ones and react strongly. Vengeful might be a strong word because one of these is definitely vengeful. One of them is more obsession. So the first one I want to recommend is Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain, starring Rachel Weisz and Hugh Jackman. It's a very spiritual film about a man whose wife is dying of cancer. He's a scientist who's obsessed with trying to save her. There are actually 3 different storylines that kind of are edited non-linearly. So you have, there's the story of the conquistador who is trying to find the Fountain of Youth, that story is written by the present day's character, Rachel Weisz, who is writing about that character. And she's the one who's dying of cancer. And then you have, the final storyline is far in the future, you have the spaceman, but not spaceman as in like space as we think about it, as in like it's a tree that is floating, ascending into the heavens in a bubble. And the person driving the ship is a man who looks like the husband who's trying to save the wife earlier in the film. They're all these characters, by the way, are all played by Hugh Jackman and Rachel Weisz. Like these characters are in all 3 stories. Like the actors are in all 3 stories, so it's kind of ambiguous about, are these the same characters? Like how do these all fit together? But basically, he becomes obsessed with conquering death because he seeks to beat his wife's cancer. And through his obsession, he becomes obsessed with fighting death and finding immortality. So that kind of ties thematically together with the Tree of Life story and into the future, where basically this spaceman is trying to ascend to the heavens to kind of achieve immortal life or to resurrect his wife. It's kind of unclear, which is part of why I like it. It's very ambiguous and kind of like a puzzle. I love it.
Well, I think that just all makes a lot of sense for Mr. Freeze, who is himself a little ambiguous in his motivations, but they always center on curing Nora.
Yes.
It's perfect.
A lot of overlap there. So I checked that one out. It's probably one of Aronofsky's, in my opinion, one of his more underrated films. And then the second one, 100% Driven by Vengeance. It's John Wick. I'm on a John Wick kick right now, guys. I mean, the dude, his wife dies, and Theon Greyjoy comes and kills his dog and steals his car. So what's the guy gonna do? I mean, he's gonna get vengeance. Oh, the dog that his dead wife gave to him when she was alive. Yeah. So,
sure.
I mean, that's a vengeful story.
Otherwise, it would be crazy.
Yes, exactly. And I recommend it because it's if you want to see some really amazing stunts and an amazing action film, it's just really well choreographed, really well shot, really well executed. Keanu Reeves, they write the script to his strengths, meaning he's a very quiet and introspective character who says few things, and when he talks, like it's really funny or really important. And the action is some of the cleanest action and stunt work I've seen in the last 10 years. And when we're looking at so many films that are so reliant on CGI or are action movies that are like chopped to hell in the editing room, it's really nice to have something that's not that. So those would be my 2 recommendations. Joshua, how about you?
I'm going to get a little literary on you because I have never thought of Mr. Freeze in this way until the beginning of this movie. And I mentioned this earlier. At the beginning of this movie, Mr. Freeze is very much Frankenstein's monster, or a version of Frankenstein's monster. You know, an accidental creation of science cursed with life, you know, in Mr. Freeze's case, like eternal life, you know, but separated. And in both cases, separated by their physicality as well as their personalities, and then they fully separate themselves by just going off to the Arctic, you know. And in the monster's case, he expresses himself in terms of poetry a lot, especially in terms of Milton. He quotes Paradise Lost a lot, you know. And while we don't have any specific quotations from Mr. Freeze, we are definitely getting very poetic turns of phrase as he waxes about his life in the Arctic with Nora and that kind of thing. So I am going to recommend, go back to the source, friends, read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Joshua, that's a great recommendation because firstly, people take Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for granted. That thing was written in like a night. That thing's a freaking masterpiece. And I know Frankenstein's been boiled down to like kind of a joke and a icon and not a good way, like an icon. I don't know, people just take him for granted. That's a great story. The writing in that's terrific. The themes are so rich. Yeah, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I think that's a great recommendation.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of this animated discussion on SubZero. Now, listeners, Caleb and I are going to take a little bit of a break to regroup before we move into the next phase of an animated discussion.
Oh man, Joshua, I'm so excited about the next phase. I think listeners are going to be really excited.
I hope that they are. I am too, because I have close watched a lot of Batman the Animated Series, but I have not super close watched Superman the Animated Series or The New Adventures of Batman, which is what we're moving into. So we're going to take a little bit of a break. I think we will be back in September. It might not be until October, but part of that is because we have to make new art and we're having new music made that is more in keeping with the Superman side of the show. And it will also give Caleb and I an opportunity to kind of, get ahead on things, including what will be our kickoff episodes. Our kickoff episode for Superman will be the 3-part Last Son of Krypton, that is the origin story and the first 3 episodes of his show. And our kickoff for Batman will be World's Finest, the 3-part episode that brings Batman and Superman together for the first time. Technically, we're doing that one out of order, but we felt like it really made the most sense to kind of set the stage for what an animated discussion is going to be going forward.
Yeah, Joshua, 100%. And I will say out there, I mean, obviously I'm kind of playing my hand, showing my hand a little bit here, but Batman, Superman, World's Finest is probably to date the best Batman, Superman crossover that could be considered a movie, even though technically it's 3 episodes, it feels like one whole movie. And I'm really excited to talk about that. And also, we're going to be talking about both Batman and Superman, not in conjunction of each other. So I think it's really important that, after establishing the Superman origin story, that, these characters do live in the same universe now. And I think that's worth talking about.
Yes. So you've got a little bit of time before we can continue the animated discussion via your podcast app. But in the meantime, you can always continue that conversation with us on Twitter. I remain at Joshua Unruh.
And I remain at CMastersTalk. That's letter C, Masters Talk.
So until next time, look up in the sky. It's a bird? It's a plane? No, it's an animated discussion.